I had never imagined that the quiet life I was trying to lead in the suburban neighborhood would turn into a battle for my safety, my home, and ultimately justice. The Homeowners Association HOA, a group I assumed was just there to maintain the lawns and organize neighborhood cleanups, quickly became a battleground. And at the center of it all was Karen, the HOA president, a woman who had far more power and malice than I ever expected. Karen was the type of person who saw herself as the queen of the neighborhood. She had an iron grip on the HOA, controlling everything from who could plant trees in their yard to what color the mailboxes could be. I wasn't the only one who found her overbearing, but I was certainly one of the few who refused to let her push me around. Unfortunately, that's what made me a target. It all began one chilly autumn afternoon when Karen showed up at my door with an official-looking document in hand. She was stern, her usual pleasant mask replaced with a cold, commanding tone. "Your grass is overgrown," she said, her eyes scanning my front yard like a hawk. "According to the HOA guidelines, you're in violation of the rules. You need to mow it immediately, or I'll fine you." I wasn't surprised. Karen had fined other neighbors for far less. But this time, I wasn't going to back down. I had done everything according to the HOA's guidelines. I had kept my yard neat and tidy. But Karen wasn't interested in being reasonable. This wasn't about the lawn. It was about control. "Karen, this is ridiculous. My grass is fine. You're just trying to find a reason to impose fines on people," I said, trying to keep my voice calm, though I could feel my blood beginning to boil. "That's the way it works here," Karen snapped. "You follow the rules, or you pay the consequences. You'll pay for the lawn care, plus a fine. And if you refuse, I'll escalate it to the board." I stood firm. "You won't win this. I've done nothing wrong." Karen smirked. "We'll see about that." With that, she turned on her heel and marched back to her car, leaving me standing on my porch, trying to process what had just happened. I knew Karen wasn't just an HOA president. She was using her position to intimidate and bully the entire neighborhood. People were too afraid to speak up because they knew what she could do to them. But I wasn't afraid. Over the next few weeks, things escalated quickly. Every small infraction in the neighborhood, whether it was a slightly crooked fence or an untrimmed hedge, became an opportunity for Karen to assert her dominance. I was soon receiving violation notices on things I had never even thought about. And when I stood up to her, she doubled down. It was clear she wasn't just following rules. She was trying to break me, to force me into submission. One evening, as I returned home from work, I saw Karen in my front yard again. This time, she was standing next to my mailbox, a tape measure in hand. She looked up when she saw me, her face tight with irritation. "Your mailbox is out of compliance. It's too far from the curb," Karen stated matter-of-factly. "That's another fine." I was done. This was the last straw. I walked up to her, trying to keep my cool. "Karen, this is absurd. My mailbox is in perfect condition. If you're going to fine me for every little thing, you'll have to take it up with the board." Karen stepped forward, raising her voice. "I am the board, and if you don't comply with my rules, I'll make sure you pay for it." Her tone was cold and menacing, but this time I wasn't backing down. I wasn't just fighting for myself. I was fighting for everyone in the neighborhood who had been bullied by her. As she stood there, glaring at me, I suddenly realized that Karen was using the HOA as a weapon, not to help the community, but to control it for her own gain. The fines she imposed were a way to make money, and the more people complied, the more power she had. Without thinking, I stepped forward, ready to confront her once and for all. But as I did, something strange happened. I saw her hand twitch at her side. Before I knew it, Karen had pulled a gun from her purse and pointed it directly at me. The cold metal of the gun glinted in the dim light of the evening, and I froze. Karen's eyes were wild with fear, but there was something else in them, something calculated. She wasn't just angry. She was terrified. "Don't move," Karen said, her voice trembling. "You don't understand what you're dealing with. This is bigger than you." I stood motionless, my heart pounding in my chest. I could feel the tension in the air, thick with the weight of what was happening. For a moment, everything went silent, as if time itself had stopped. I had never imagined that it would come to this, Karen, with her weapon drawn, trying to intimidate me into submission. But then, something shifted inside me. I realized that the only thing Karen had left was her fear. She wasn't holding a gun because she was confident she could win. She was holding it because she was desperate. Desperate to keep the control she had so carefully constructed. And in that moment, I knew I could turn the tables on her. I could use her own fear against her. Karen, I said, my voice steady despite the situation, you think you can intimidate me, but I'm not scared of you. Karen's eyes narrowed. You don't know who you're dealing with. She spat. You'll regret this. You think I'm afraid of your gun. I said, stepping forward slowly. I've seen your kind before. You've been manipulating this whole neighborhood, using the HOA as a tool to line your pockets. But now the game is over, and I'm going to make sure everyone knows the truth. I could see the doubt flicker in her eyes, and I pushed further. I know about your deals, Karen. The illegal contracts. The money you've been skimming off the top. The lies you've been telling the HOA. I've got all the proof, and if you don't put that gun down and let me leave, I'll make sure it all comes out. Her hand wavered, and for a brief moment, I saw her resolve crack. The fear that had been driving her began to overtake her confidence. The gun lowered slightly, but she wasn't ready to surrender just yet. You can't do this, she said, her voice breaking. You have no idea who you're dealing with. You're right, Karen, I said, finally taking a step back, but I'm about to find out everything. In that moment, I knew I had her. She was afraid of being exposed, afraid of losing everything she had worked so hard to manipulate. Her power was built on fear, and now that fear was turned back on her. With the evidence I had gathered and the leverage I now had over her, Karen's grip on the neighborhood began to slip away. The more I learned about her dealings, the more I realized just how deep the corruption went. I wasn't going to let her get away with it. Not now, not ever. The following day, I contacted the authorities, making sure they had all the proof they needed to bring her down for good. The evidence was overwhelming. From manipulated property deals to financial fraud, Karen's entire operation came crashing down around her. The next few days were a whirlwind. The evidence I had gathered, combined with Karen's actions, made it clear that her empire was built on a foundation of lies, manipulation, and fear. The authorities launched a full investigation into her dealings, seizing documents, contracts, and financial records that proved just how deep her corruption ran. I could feel the weight lifting off my shoulders as more people came forward, willing to share their stories of intimidation and blackmail. But Karen, true to form, wasn't going to go down without a fight. Her legal team immediately went to work, filing motions to have the evidence dismissed, claiming it was either fabricated or obtained illegally. They were doing everything they could to discredit me, to discredit the authorities, but it didn't matter. The evidence was real, and Karen's reputation was rapidly crumbling. I received a call from my attorney just a few days after the investigation had started. The authorities want to meet with you. They've discovered something you need to know, he said. I met him at his office, my heart racing with anticipation. As I walked in, I could tell from his expression that this wasn't just a routine update. He motioned for me to sit. They found something. It's worse than we thought, he said, handing me a file filled with paperwork. It turns out Karen wasn't just manipulating homeowners and stealing from the HOA. She was using her position to funnel money into offshore accounts and funding illegal real estate deals. My eyes widened as I skimmed through the documents. Karen had been working with developers who were using shady tactics to acquire properties in the neighborhood at a fraction of their value. She had been pressuring homeowners to sell, often under duress, only to sell those properties for a massive profit to these developers. And all of this was happening under the guise of the HOA, which she had used as a tool to control the community. She was essentially laundering money, my attorney said, shaking his head. And the worst part is, she wasn't working alone. There are others involved, people with enough power to make sure this whole thing was kept under wraps for years. I felt a sickening sense of realization. Karen wasn't just a petty tyrant, using the HOA to manipulate people. She was part of a much larger network of corruption. This was bigger than I had imagined, and the people involved weren't going to let her go down easily. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the information over and over in my head. How had Karen managed to keep everything under wraps for so long? How had she manipulated so many people without anyone noticing? The more I thought about it, the more I realized that Karen had been using fear to control everyone in the neighborhood. Fear of fines, fear of legal action, fear of being ostracized. And it had worked. But now, as the truth started to come out, that fear was starting to unravel. I knew that this was far from over. The investigation was just the beginning, and Karen wasn't going to give up her power easily. I still had to deal with the aftermath, the fallout from everything she had done. There would be people who tried to protect her, people who had benefited from her schemes, and I had to be prepared for the worst. The next day, I received a call from my attorney once again. "Karen's not sitting idle," he said. "She's filed a counterclaim against you. She's accusing you of slander and threatening to sue you for everything you're worth." I wasn't surprised. Karen was a fighter, and she would do anything to maintain her grip on power. But now that the truth was coming out, she didn't have much left to fight with. The evidence against her was overwhelming, and the authorities weren't backing down. They were committed to seeing this through, and they knew that Karen's network of corruption went far beyond just her. "I'm not worried about her threats," I said, trying to keep my calm. "What's more important is that we keep pushing forward. We can't let her intimidate us." I knew that Karen's legal team would try every trick in the book to slow the investigation down, to stall the process, and to discredit me. But we had one thing on our side: the truth. And the truth was unstoppable. As the investigation progressed, more of Karen's secrets came to light. The developers she had been working with were implicated in the scheme, and the authorities were able to trace money transfers and shady land deals all the way back to her. It wasn't just about the stolen money anymore. It was about how she had used her position to create a web of corruption that had ensnared everyone around her. But as the case began to heat up, Karen went into hiding. She stopped showing up for her court dates, stopped responding to subpoenas. It was clear she was running scared, hoping that by staying out of sight, she could avoid the consequences of her actions. But I wasn't going to let her get away that easily. My attorney and I worked closely with the authorities, tracking down leads and piecing together the last of the evidence. It was a race against time. Karen's allies were getting desperate, doing everything they could to protect her. But no one was above the law, not anymore. One day, I received a call from my attorney that would change everything. "Karen has been located," he said. "She's holed up in a safe house in a neighboring town. The authorities are going to make their move." I could hardly believe it. After all this time, Karen was finally within our reach. But I knew this wasn't going to be an easy capture. She was cornered now, and cornered animals were the most dangerous. The authorities swarmed the safe house, and after a tense standoff, Karen was arrested. Her once powerful network of influence was in ruins. The documents we had provided were more than enough to secure her conviction, and the authorities were already looking into her connections with the developers and officials she had been working with. But as Karen was led away in handcuffs, I couldn't help but feel a strange sense of closure. The fight had been long and exhausting, but it had been worth it. The neighborhood was free from her control, and the truth had finally come to light. The feeling of relief that washed over me when I heard the news of Karen's arrest was tempered by the realization that the battle wasn't truly over. Yes, she was behind bars, but the ramifications of her actions were far-reaching, and I wasn't naive enough to think that everything would magically get better just because she was caught. The true extent of her corruption had yet to be fully exposed, and I knew that it wasn't just Karen who needed to face the consequences. There were still people out there, people in positions of power, who had helped her carry out her schemes, and they needed to be held accountable as well. The authorities had already begun the long process of going through the evidence we had uncovered, but even with her in jail, I felt a growing sense of unease. The city officials who had turned a blind eye to Karen's actions were still out there, and the developers she had worked with were not going to let their money train come to a halt without a fight. I had exposed Karen's manipulation of the HOA, but the rest of her network, the people she had been working with, the people who had been benefiting from her scheme, were still lurking in the shadows. I began receiving more anonymous messages, some from people within the community who had information but were too afraid to speak out publicly. These messages, though vague and cryptic, were enough to remind me that the fight was far from over. They kept telling me to be careful, warning me that Karen wasn't the only one who needed to be taken down. One night, I received another call from an unexpected source, Sarah, a neighbor who had been one of Karen's first victims. She had suffered from one of the inflated property deals Karen had orchestrated and had been forced to sell her house for far less than it was worth. "I need to talk to you." Sarah's voice trembled over the phone. "There's more to Karen's story than you realize. She wasn't acting alone." I felt a surge of adrenaline. "What do you mean?" Sarah paused. "I was doing some digging of my own after everything started to unravel, and I found something that connects Karen to a much bigger operation. I don't know how deep this goes, but I'm scared. I don't want to get involved, but you have to know." She explained that Karen had been receiving payments from developers and even city officials to push certain zoning laws in their favor. In return, Karen used her influence to manipulate the HOA rules, forcing homeowners to sell their properties under market value so that the developers could buy them cheaply and resell them for profit. It was a web of corruption, and Karen had been at the center of it all. But Sarah had uncovered something more disturbing, evidence that Karen's operation had reached all the way to the top. "Karen wasn't just running this operation herself," Sarah said, her voice growing more urgent. "She had connections with people in City Hall. She was bribing officials to make sure her deals went through. If this information gets out, it's going to bring down more than just her." I thanked Sarah for the information and promised her that I would do everything I could to make sure the truth came out. I immediately shared what she had told me with my attorney and the authorities. If Sarah's suspicions were correct, this could be the breakthrough we needed to expose the entire corrupt network. But it also meant we were dealing with much more dangerous people than we had anticipated. Karen might be in custody, but the people who had helped her weren't going to sit idly by while their secrets were exposed. We spent the next few weeks diving deeper into the evidence, connecting the dots between Karen's dealings and the developers and city officials she had been working with. We found email chains, financial records, and recordings that linked some of the most powerful people in the city to the illegal transactions. It was clear that this wasn't just about Karen's greed anymore. It was about an entire system of corruption that had been operating right under our noses. As we prepared to take our findings to the authorities, the threats against me intensified. I received more phone calls, more anonymous messages, warning me to stop digging, to leave things alone before I found myself in over my head. But I wasn't about to back down. Not now. Not after everything Karen had done to the community, to my neighbors, to me. The pressure was building, but I knew I couldn't stop. If we didn't expose this now, the cycle of corruption would continue, and more people would be hurt. I contacted a journalist I trusted, someone who had covered corruption stories in the past, and handed over all the evidence we had. I knew that if the story hit the press, it would be impossible for the authorities to ignore it. A week later, the story broke. The headline read, "Local HOA President Exposed as Ringleader of Multimillion-Dollar Corruption Scheme." The article detailed everything Karen had done, how she had manipulated the HOA, bribed officials, and exploited the residents for personal gain. It also revealed the full extent of her illegal dealings, including her connections to powerful developers and city officials. The story sent shockwaves through the community, and within hours, it was picked up by larger news outlets. The reaction was immediate. Residents who had been too afraid to speak out for years began to flood social media with their own stories, sharing how Karen's manipulation had affected their lives. The authorities were forced to act quickly, launching a full investigation into the corrupt network that Karen had built. Her associates, people she had been working with, were suddenly being investigated as well, and it wasn't long before arrests were made. But Karen wasn't the only one feeling the heat. The real estate developers, the city officials, the corrupt HOA members, everyone who had played a part in her scheme was now being scrutinized. The web of corruption was finally unraveling, and people were being held accountable for their actions. But just as the momentum was building, Karen made a desperate move. She hired a new, aggressive legal team and filed for an appeal, trying to get her charges dropped. Her defense was flimsy at best, but she was desperate. She was willing to fight tooth and nail to keep her freedom. even if it meant dragging the process on for months. I wasn't worried. We had the evidence, and the authorities were already committed to seeing this through. Karen might have been a master manipulator, but she couldn't hide from the truth forever. The community had finally found its voice, and we weren't going to let her get away with it. Karen's appeal was her last attempt at gaining control over a situation that was quickly spiraling out of her hands. She had been used to manipulating people for so long that I could tell she thought her legal team could work some magic and somehow reverse the situation. However, the case against her was airtight. Her empire of lies was collapsing under the weight of the truth, and no amount of legal maneuvering was going to save her now. Still, I knew that the real battle wasn't just about proving her guilt in court. It was about making sure the community didn't forget what had happened. Karen had systematically broken down the trust between neighbors, exploiting her position to benefit herself while running the neighborhood into the ground. I wasn't going to let her walk away without facing the full consequences. As the weeks passed, the media coverage intensified. Karen's arrest was no longer just a local story. It was now a symbol of the kind of corruption that could thrive when unchecked power was left in the hands of a single person. The news outlets were filled with stories of her manipulation, and the calls for accountability were growing louder by the day. Despite her legal team's best efforts, the investigation continued to uncover more details about Karen's operation. The more we uncovered, the worse it got. She had been involved in everything from money laundering to rigging property sales. The authorities had started tracing the flow of money from her offshore accounts, and it became clear that she had been involved in a far-reaching criminal network. I kept thinking back to the moment when I first stood up to her, when I had confronted her in my yard, defying her power. I hadn't realized it then, but that was the turning point. It was the moment I decided not to cower in the face of her threats and manipulation. Looking back, it felt almost surreal how much had changed since that confrontation. I had started as just another neighbor trying to live in peace, and now I was at the center of a story that was exposing the very fabric of corruption in our community. But even with everything moving forward, there was still a part of me that was unsure. Karen had powerful allies, and I knew they wouldn't let her go down without a fight. They'd be willing to do whatever it took to protect their interests, and I wasn't naive enough to think they wouldn't try to influence the outcome of the case. Every step of the way, there had been threats, and as the pressure mounted, I could feel the weight of it all pressing down on me. Still, I wasn't going to back down. A few days later, I received a phone call that shook me to my core. The caller was anonymous, their voice distorted by a deep, mechanical filter. "You've got no idea what you're doing," the voice warned, cold and menacing. "You think you've won? Karen is just the beginning. We have much more power than you realize, and if you keep pushing, you'll regret it." I felt my pulse quicken as I tried to remain calm. The threats had started before, but this one felt different, more direct, more threatening. "You think you're going to intimidate me into stopping? I've got the truth on my side," I said, trying to sound as confident as I could. The voice on the other end chuckled darkly. "You can't fight us. But go ahead, keep pushing. You won't last long." I ended the call, my mind racing. Karen's allies were clearly circling, trying to intimidate me into backing off. But I couldn't let their threats stop me. This wasn't just about Karen anymore. It was about exposing the corruption she had been hiding and ensuring that those who helped her face justice as well. They couldn't win. They wouldn't win. I contacted my attorney again, relaying the details of the call. He reassured me that these were just empty threats, meant to instill fear. "We have the evidence. We're doing things the right way. These people can't scare you into silence," he said. But even with his comforting words, I knew that the stakes had just risen. With the threats now escalating, I decided to take extra precautions. I increased security at my home, made sure my computer systems were secure, and contacted local law enforcement to inform them of the situation. The last thing I wanted was to fall victim to something more sinister as this case reached its climax. In the days that followed, more details about Karen's illegal dealings began to surface. The developers she had worked with, the city officials she had bribed. It was all starting to fall apart. As the authorities gathered more evidence, it became clear that Karen had been running an entire underground network, using her position in the HOA to manipulate the housing market and enrich herself and her associates. The investigation reached a boiling point when it was revealed that Karen had been involved in a scheme to manipulate property values, driving up prices in certain neighborhoods and forcing homeowners into deals that left them financially ruined. The money she had made was staggering, and the damage she had caused to the community was incalculable. But the authorities weren't finished yet. They were determined to take down the entire operation, not just Karen. Finally, the trial date was set. After months of preparation, the moment of truth had arrived. I sat in the courtroom, my nerves taut as I watched Karen enter, her smug demeanor still intact. Despite everything, she acted like she was above it all, still convinced that she could escape the consequences of her actions. But this time, she was facing an entire community that had come together to take her down, and no amount of bravado was going to save her. The proceedings were tense as the prosecution laid out the evidence against Karen. The documents, the testimonies, and the financial records all painted a picture of a woman who had used her position for her own gain, trampling over anyone who got in her way. There was no doubt in anyone's mind that Karen had orchestrated an elaborate scheme of corruption, manipulation, and exploitation. The trial dragged on for days, but each new revelation chipped away at Karen's defense. Her once formidable legal team was starting to show signs of strain, unable to deny the overwhelming evidence. It was clear that they were losing the battle, and Karen could no longer hide behind her lies. As the trial neared its end, I couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. It wasn't just about the victory for me. It was about the entire neighborhood that had suffered under Karen's reign. We had all been victims of her manipulations, but now we were standing together, united in our fight for justice. And Karen, she was running out of options. The tension in the courtroom had reached its peak. Karen sat at the defendant's table, her face pale, her once proud posture now slumped under the weight of the charges against her. For the first time, she looked like someone who truly understood that her empire was crumbling. Her usual arrogance was gone, replaced by an air of desperation. The prosecution's case was airtight. The evidence of Karen's illegal dealings, her manipulation of HOA funds, and the manipulation of homeowners had been laid out in excruciating detail. There was nowhere for Karen to hide, no legal loophole she could exploit to escape the consequences of her actions. And as I watched the case unfold, I knew the time had finally come for Karen to pay for everything she had done. But Karen wasn't going down without a fight. Her defense attorney had been relentless, trying to poke holes in the evidence, attempting to cast doubt on every witness's testimony. But with each new piece of evidence, it was becoming more and more apparent that her chances of walking away scot-free were slim. The damage she had caused to the community was undeniable, and it was clear that the jury was starting to see her for what she truly was, a woman who had exploited her position for personal gain at the expense of everyone around her. As the trial continued, Karen's attorneys made a last-ditch effort to discredit the witnesses who had come forward, hoping to cast doubt on their credibility. They tried to argue that the testimony was biased, that the documents were forged, but each time, the prosecution was ready with the truth. The forensic accountants who had examined the financial records were able to corroborate every detail, and the testimony of my neighbors, people who had suffered at Karen's hands, was powerful enough to sway even the most skeptical jurors. I could feel the weight of the trial bearing down on me. The nights were sleepless as I thought about everything that had led me to this point. It had started with a simple complaint about my mailbox, and now, here I was, standing up not just for myself, but for everyone who had been victimized by Karen's corruption. The journey had been long, and at times, I doubted whether we would ever make it this far. But as the trial approached its climax, I felt a sense of satisfaction I hadn't expected. Karen's reign of terror was coming to an end. The judge called for a recess, and we all stood up, stretching our legs and trying to shake off the tension. I made my way outside the courtroom to clear my mind, but I wasn't alone. My attorney caught up with me, his face grim. "We've got her cornered," he said, his voice low. "But there's still one last hurdle. The defense is about to introduce new evidence, something we weren't expecting." My stomach churned. "What is it?" "I don't know yet," he said. "But whatever it is, we need to be ready." We returned to the courtroom, and sure enough, Karen's defense team had one last trick up their sleeves. They presented what they claimed was a signed document from several of the HOA board members, supposedly stating that Karen had been acting within the guidelines of her position. The document seemed to suggest that the board had approved her actions and that everything she had done was part of her duties as president. It was a desperate move, but it was enough to throw a wrench into the proceedings. The jury was stunned. This new evidence could potentially give Karen the leverage she needed to argue that her actions had been authorized, that she wasn't acting alone. For a moment, it felt like the entire case could slip through our fingers. But I wasn't about to let that happen. I stood up, my mind racing as I thought through the situation. Karen's legal team might have brought new evidence to the table, but I knew we could refute it. We had done our homework, and I wasn't going to let one last-ditch attempt to discredit everything we had worked for. Your Honor, I said, my voice clear and confident, I request that we be given the opportunity to investigate this new evidence thoroughly. We believe this document is a fabrication, just another attempt to cover up Karen's illegal activities. The judge nodded, agreeing to the request. The courtroom fell into a tense silence as both sides prepared for what would be the final phase of the trial. I knew we couldn't afford to let our guard down now. If we didn't push back hard enough, Karen's defense might just find a way to turn the tide in her favor. The next few days were critical. My attorney and I worked tirelessly to verify the document presented by Karen's defense. We contacted the HOA board members who were supposedly behind the document and found that several of them had never even seen it before. In fact, one of them had gone on record stating that Karen had been acting outside of the board's approval, further implicating her in the fraud. The document had been a complete fabrication, a last-ditch effort by Karen's legal team to save her. We presented our findings to the court, and the judge immediately ruled that the document was inadmissible. It was a huge victory for us. Karen's defense crumbled under the weight of the truth, and it became clear to everyone in the courtroom that her attempts to manipulate the legal system had failed. But just when we thought the end was in sight, Karen's desperation grew. She took a risk, something that would backfire in the worst possible way. During one of the closing arguments, she stood up and, in a last-ditch attempt to win the jury's sympathy, claimed that she had been coerced into her actions, that she had been blackmailed by people in higher positions of power. It was a bold move, but it was also a dangerous one. She was trying to paint herself as a victim, trying to shift the blame onto others. The jury was not impressed. Her credibility had already been shattered, and this was the final straw. The judge, clearly annoyed by her attempt to manipulate the proceedings, dismissed her claim as baseless. It was over. Karen's lies had finally caught up with her, and there was no escaping the consequences. The judge deliberated for a few more hours before returning to announce the verdict. As she spoke, the weight of it all seemed to hang in the air. Karen had been found guilty on multiple counts of fraud, conspiracy, and abuse of power. Her sentencing would be determined soon, but it was clear that her reign of terror was finally over. The moment the verdict was delivered, the tension in the courtroom was palpable. Karen's face was ashen, her hands trembling as she sat there, absorbing the weight of the judgment. For the first time, she looked like someone who understood that the walls she had built around herself were finally coming down. But there was no triumph in my heart. I had fought for so long to expose the truth, but the journey wasn't over. There was still work to be done. The sentencing hearing was set for the following week. As I walked out of the courtroom, I felt the full weight of everything that had happened. This wasn't just about one woman and her abuses of power. It was about the system that allowed her to flourish unchecked, about the way that corruption had seeped into every corner of the neighborhood, affecting families, livelihoods, and the very community we had all tried to protect. I spent the next few days reflecting on everything we had uncovered. The investigation had exposed not only Karen's illegal activities, but also the deep-rooted corruption that had been festering in the neighborhood for years. It wasn't just about the inflated fines or the manipulated property deals anymore. It was about people who had turned a blind eye to what was happening because they stood to gain from it. Those people, too, needed to be held accountable. As the sentencing day approached, I began to notice something troubling. The whispers started again. This time, it wasn't just about Karen. People were talking about the fallout from the trial, how Karen's allies in the real estate world were already making moves to distance themselves from her, how the local officials, who had been involved in her schemes, were starting to cover their tracks. I had expected it, but now the reality was setting in. These were powerful people, people who had a lot more to lose than Karen ever did. I couldn't let them escape. I had already risked so much to get to this point, and I wasn't about to let it all unravel now. I had spent countless hours gathering evidence, building a case that was solid enough to bring Karen down. But I needed more. I needed to ensure that no one else in the network slipped through the cracks. I reached out to a few of the former homeowners who had been victims of Karen's scams. They had been reluctant to speak out before, fearing retaliation, but now that the truth was out, they were ready to tell their stories. I asked them to meet with the authorities and share everything they knew, everything they had been pressured into doing by Karen and her associates. This wasn't just about one person anymore. This was about the entire system that had allowed her to manipulate everyone in her path. As more people came forward, the pieces started to fall into place. One by one, the key figures in Karen's network were identified. The city officials who had helped her cover up her deals, the developers who had profited from her manipulation. They all had their hands in the pot. And one by one, they were beginning to realize that their involvement in Karen's scheme was coming to light. But Karen's arrest wasn't the only consequence. The investigation had set off a chain reaction, and now the ripple effects were spreading far beyond our neighborhood. I couldn't help but feel a sense of unease as I watched the wheels of justice slowly turning. Every day, I received new threats, warnings to back off, to stop digging. They were trying to intimidate me, to make me fear for my safety. But I had already seen the worst of what they could do. Karen had pulled a gun on me in an attempt to force me into silence, and I hadn't backed down then. I wasn't going to back down now. In the midst of all this, I received another call from Richard, the man who had initially helped me by providing information on Karen's illegal dealings. He had been keeping a close eye on the developments, and his voice on the phone was laced with concern. "You need to be careful," Richard warned. "I've been hearing rumors. People who were part of Karen's operation are going to great lengths to cover their tracks. Some of them are trying to flee the country. You need to be ready. They won't let this go easily." His words sent a chill down my spine. I knew he was right. Karen's network was vast, and the people involved weren't just going to disappear quietly. They would fight tooth and nail to protect their interests, and I had no doubt that they'd try to silence anyone who stood in their way. The next few days were a blur. The authorities were working around the clock to investigate Karen's associates, but the danger was real. The more I uncovered, the more I realized that this wasn't just a matter of taking down Karen. It was about exposing an entire network of corruption, and some of the people involved were far more dangerous than Karen ever was. It became clear that I was no longer just fighting for my own justice. I was fighting for everyone who had been affected by Karen's actions, for the people who had been manipulated, bullied, and exploited by her and her cronies. But with each step forward, I could feel the heat intensifying. The closer we got to uncovering the truth, the more desperate Karen's associates became. As the sentencing hearing approached, I tried to prepare myself for the outcome. Part of me was hopeful that Karen would be held accountable for everything she had done, but another part of me feared the possibility that the people she had been working with might still get away with their crimes. The trial had been a monumental victory, but it was just the beginning. There was still so much work to be done. The day of the sentencing arrived, and I could feel the tension in the air. The courtroom was packed, the air thick with anticipation. Karen was led in, looking small and defeated compared to the powerful figure she had once been. But I knew better than to think this was the end. It was just another step in the long road to bringing the full extent of her crimes to light. The judge's words were firm as he delivered the sentence. Karen would face years in prison for her crimes, but there was still more to come. The investigation into her associates was ongoing, and the full extent of the network she had built was still being unraveled. For now, Karen's downfall was complete, but the fight wasn't over. As I walked out of the courtroom, I took a deep breath. The battle had been long, and it wasn't over yet, but the community was finally free from Karen's stranglehold. We had won, but the real work was just beginning. The truth was finally out, and justice was being served, one step at a time. As the weeks passed after Karen's sentencing, The weight of everything that had transpired started to settle. The community, once fractured by fear, now began to come together. People who had been too afraid to speak out for years were now openly sharing their stories, and for the first time in a long while, there was hope. But even as the neighborhood began to heal, I knew that Karen's downfall was just the tip of the iceberg. The corruption that had plagued our community for so long wasn't going to disappear overnight. While the authorities continued their investigation into Karen's associates, I worked tirelessly with my attorney to ensure that the legal consequences for those involved went as far as they could. We wanted to make sure that everyone who had been complicit in Karen's scheme faced justice. It wasn't just about the financial penalties or the jail time. It was about holding these people accountable for the damage they had done to innocent homeowners who had trusted the system. One morning, I received a call that would once again change everything. It was from the authorities. They had uncovered a series of secret meetings that Karen had been having with one of the city's most influential real estate developers. This developer had been connected to a series of illicit land deals and had been funneling money through Karen's HOA position to gain access to properties at a fraction of their value. It was clear now that the full scope of the corruption ran deeper than we had ever imagined. I met with the authorities to review the new findings. The developer in question had ties to several city officials, and the money trail they uncovered led directly to accounts in offshore tax havens. Karen had not only been extorting homeowners, but she had also been part of a massive real estate scam, using her position as the HOA president to manipulate property values. The greed behind it all was staggering. This new discovery opened up a whole new layer of the case. Karen was no longer just a corrupt HOA president. She was a key player in an organized criminal operation that spanned much further than our community. The authorities were now investigating the developer, his connections to corrupt city officials, and the illegal activities that had been happening under their noses for years. The deeper we dug, the more secrets we uncovered. The developer wasn't just manipulating real estate deals. He was involved in illegal construction projects that endangered public safety, bribing officials to overlook building code violations, and laundering money through fake companies. This wasn't just a case of financial fraud. It was about lives being put at risk for the sake of profit. The more we learned, the more enraged I became. But with each new piece of evidence, the danger around me escalated. Karen's allies were not going down without a fight. I started receiving threatening phone calls, and I was followed on more than one occasion. It became clear that they were trying to intimidate me into backing off, to make sure I didn't expose more of their dirty dealings. But I had come too far to stop now. The truth had to come out, and no amount of threats was going to silence me. I wasn't alone in this fight. The community, once afraid of Karen and her influence, now stood united. The residents who had been manipulated, the people whose homes had been stolen or devalued, they were all coming forward. It wasn't just about me anymore. It was about all of us, fighting to reclaim what had been taken from us. The authorities were working around the clock, following leads, and gathering more evidence to build a case against the remaining criminals in Karen's network. Then, one night, just as I thought the investigation was wrapping up, I received a tip. It was from someone within the developer's company. They had been watching the news and had seen the articles about Karen's conviction. They knew that Karen had been involved in something much bigger, but they were too afraid to speak out before. Now, they were ready to help. The tip they gave me was a game changer. It was proof that Karen and the developer had been bribing officials at the highest levels of government, and it pointed directly to a cover-up that reached far beyond our city. The developer had been working with corrupt officials to siphon off taxpayer money for construction projects that were never completed, while lining their own pockets with kickbacks. The money from these deals had been funneled through shell companies, hidden in international bank accounts, and used to fund lavish lifestyles for the people involved. With this new evidence, I knew it was time to take everything to the authorities once more. The stakes had never been higher. The scale of the corruption was massive, and the people involved were dangerous. But the more I uncovered, the more I realized that this wasn't just a fight for justice. It was a fight for the future of the community. These people had been exploiting us for too long, and now it was time for them to face the consequences. The authorities immediately launched a coordinated raid on the developer's office, seizing documents, financial records, and evidence that proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that he and his associates had been running an illegal operation for years. The investigation spread to other cities, where officials were implicated in the cover-up and more arrests were made. The community was starting to feel a sense of relief, but there was still a long way to go before everything was fully exposed. As the pieces of the puzzle fell into place, I realized that this battle wasn't just mine. It was ours. It was the neighborhood coming together to fight back against the people who had used their power for personal gain. And while Karen had been the face of this operation, she was just one cog in a much larger machine. This was about dismantling the entire corrupt system that had been allowed to operate unchecked for so long. The fight wasn't over yet, but as I stood in front of the courthouse, watching the convicted criminals being led away in handcuffs, I couldn't help but feel a sense of victory. The truth had been exposed. The people who had been exploited and manipulated had been heard. And for once, justice had prevailed. As the story of Karen and her web of corruption finally came to an end, I couldn't help but reflect on the journey it took to bring her and her associates to justice. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't quick, but in the end, the truth prevailed. And that's something we can all be proud of. If you've been following along and want to see more stories of justice, corruption, and how ordinary people can stand up against the odds, make sure to like this video and subscribe to stay updated. You won't want to miss what happens next as we continue to fight for what's right. Thanks for being part of this journey.